The Gulfstream G700 touched down at San Francisco International with the kind of precision that only came from pilots who'd logged combat hours before retiring to corporate aviation. Through the tinted windows of the VIP terminal, the city's skyline glittered in the late morning sun. Towers of glass and steel built on ambition, desperation, and the kind of money that changed hands faster than most people could count it. The jet's engines wound down to a whisper. Someone outside moved to position the stairs. Inside the cabin, a man sat alone in cream leather that cost more than most sedans. His suit was charcoal Tom Ford, tailored in a way that suggested wealth without screaming it. The watch on his wrist, a Patek Philippe Nautilus, carried a price tag that could fund a startup through Series A. But these weren't the details that mattered. What mattered was the stillness in his posture, the absolute absence of triumph or rage in his expression. Dominic Vaughn had been many things in his 41 years. Stanford graduate, MIT scholar, Google senior engineer before he turned 25, founder of 3 startups that either succeeded spectacularly or failed fast enough to teach him what mattered. And for the past 11 years, the invisible hand behind Obsidian Capital, a private equity fund that moved $8 billion with the kind of discretion that kept his face off Forbes covers and his name out of TechCrunch headlines. But for the past 5 years, he'd been something else entirely, a man pretending to be poor. The cabin door opened. California sunlight flooded in, carrying the smell of jet fuel and salt from the bay. A voice filtered through from outside, professional and deferential. "Welcome back to San Francisco, Mr. Vaughn. Shall we proceed to the stock exchange viewing party?" Dominic stood, adjusting his cuffs with the mechanical precision of someone who'd made the gesture 10,000 times. His reflection caught in the cabin's polished surfaces, dark hair touched with gray at the temples, green eyes that had learned to reveal nothing, the kind of face that could pass for 35 or 50, depending on the light. He descended the stairs into air that tasted like memory and consequence. The Rolls-Royce Phantom waited on the tarmac, black as a judge's robe. The chauffeur held the door. Dominic slid into leather that smelled like money and old decisions. As the car pulled away from the private terminal, his phone buzzed. A text from his 9-year-old daughter, Scarlett, who was back at the hotel with security. "Dad, good luck today. Remember, truth always wins, right?" He typed back, "Truth takes time, sweetheart, but it gets there." The phone went dark. In its reflection, he saw himself as he'd been 14 months ago, standing in a penthouse that belonged to someone else, signing papers that gave away $10 billion in potential wealth without taking a single cent. People called it dignity. His ex-wife called it stupidity. He called it the only choice a man could make when he needed to know what his life was actually worth. The voiceover in his mind, the one that had narrated every major decision since Catherine died, spoke with quiet certainty. She thought silence meant surrender. She forgot that sometimes silence is just patience wearing the face of defeat. 14 months earlier, June 2024, the apartment in Daly City smelled like burnt coffee and the particular kind of resignation that came from living somewhere temporary for too long. 2 bedrooms, IKEA furniture assembled by someone who'd given up halfway through, a television from 2018 that still worked if you hit it right. The kitchen window looked out on a parking lot where a Honda Civic sat rusting in its assigned spot, paint oxidizing under California sun. Dominic stood at that window now, watching dawn break over a neighborhood that had seen better decades. He wore jeans from a Walmart clearance rack and a flannel shirt that had cost $9. His feet were bare against linoleum that needed replacing. Everything about this apartment screamed struggle, and that was exactly the point. Behind him, Scarlett sat at the kitchen table, spooning Cheerios into her mouth with the mechanical efficiency of a child who'd learned not to waste food. She was small for 9, all dark hair and serious green eyes that belonged to someone twice her age. Her backpack sat by the door, already packed for school. On the table beside her cereal bowl sat a laptop, A Dell from 2019 with a cracked screen and a sticker that read, Obsidian Capital, in letters so small you'd miss them if you weren't looking. Dad, do you have your big meeting today? Dominic turned from the window. The morning light caught the gray in his hair, the lines around his eyes that came from carrying secrets. I do, sweetheart, but remember, we don't tell anyone. She recited it like a catechism. Not even Mom Elise, especially not her. I need to know she loves me for me, not for money. Scarlett chewed thoughtfully, her expression grave in the way only children who'd watched a parent die could manage. Are you scared? Every day. But being scared doesn't mean we don't do what's right. She nodded, accepting this with the same equanimity she'd accepted everything since Catherine died 7 years ago. That was the thing about losing your mother to stress-induced illness before you turned 3. You learned early that the world didn't care about fairness, only what you could survive. Dominic's phone buzzed on the counter. The screen lit up with an email notification, and for half a second the subject line was visible. Board approval, $2.4 billion acquisition, Sterling Tech. He swiped it away before Scarlett could see, but she'd already gone back to her cereal. The laptop sticker might have given him away to someone who knew what to look for, but Elise had never bothered looking. That was the fundamental problem with their marriage. She'd stopped seeing him the moment she decided who he was. Outside, a car alarm bleated and died. Somewhere in the building, a baby cried. This was the life Elise thought he lived, paycheck to paycheck, barely scraping by, dependent on her generosity for scraps. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't been so perfectly designed to reveal her character. Dominic poured himself coffee from a pot that had burned the grounds, drank it black because they were out of milk, and began the morning routine of a man whose bank account showed $300 when anyone bothered to check. The secondary accounts, the ones routed through shell corporations in Delaware and the Cayman Islands, the ones that held $680 million in liquid assets, and another $8 billion in managed portfolios, those existed in a parallel universe that Elise couldn't see because she'd never thought to look past the surface. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a call, and the name on the screen made him step into the bedroom before answering. Paige. Mr. Vaughn. His assistant's voice carried the crisp efficiency of someone who'd managed billionaires long enough to know when they were playing dress-up. The board wants confirmation on Sterling Tech. Legal has cleared everything. They're waiting on your authorization. Approved. Execute at market open. Understood. Also, the forensic analysis you requested on Payflow's patent filings, Dr. Cross finished overnight. The results are significant. Dominic's hand tightened on the phone. Through the thin bedroom wall, he could hear Scarlett humming something off-key while she finished breakfast. How significant? 87% code match with your 2019 commits. Every major function, every architectural decision, every security protocol, it's all yours. Ms. Morrison's contributions amount to business logic and UI suggestions. The core algorithm is entirely your work. The room seemed to tilt slightly, though Dominic's expression never changed. He'd known this, of course, had known it since September 2021, when the Google alert pinged him about the patent filing. But knowing something and having it confirmed by forensic analysis were different animals. Send me the full report, encrypted, and Paige, thank you. One more thing, sir. The background check on Garrett Ashford that you requested. 3 documented workplace affairs in previous positions. One resulted in a sexual harassment settlement that his former employer paid to make quiet. Another contributed to a colleague's divorce. He has a pattern. Of course he did. Men like Garrett Ashford were as predictable as gravity once you knew what to look for. Elise had chosen him because he represented everything Dominic supposedly wasn't. Successful, ambitious, publicly wealthy. She hadn't bothered to check whether that success was built on competence or just confidence in a good suit. Keep monitoring. I want to know every meeting he takes, every investor he talks to. If he's planning to sell a lease out, I want advance notice. Understood, sir. The call ended. Dominic stood in the small bedroom with its thrift store dresser and its single window that looked out on an alley, and allowed himself 5 seconds of pure rage. Not at Elise. He'd stopped being angry at her months ago, once he understood that her betrayal came from fear rather than malice. Not even at Garrett, who was just a symptom of a larger disease. No, the rage was for himself, for thinking he could engineer human behavior like code, for believing that poverty could be a test rather than a trap, for the arrogance of playing God with someone else's character development. The 5 seconds passed. The rage went back into whatever box he kept it in. He returned to the kitchen where Scarlett was rinsing her cereal bowl with the kind of care that suggested water bills mattered. Ready for school? Ready. They walked to the bus stop together, Dominic in his Walmart flannel and Scarlett in a backpack that had cost $200 but looked like it came from Target. The morning was cool, fog rolling in off the bay the way it always did. Other kids waited at the stop with parents who looked genuinely broke, not performatively poor. Dominic felt the weight of his deception like a stone in his chest. One of the mothers, a woman named Rosa, who worked 2 jobs and still struggled with rent, smiled at him with the kind of solidarity that came from shared struggle. Rough week, Dominic? Aren't they all? She laughed, bitter and knowing, and he hated himself a little more. These people were living the life he was pretending to live, and their grace in the face of it made his experiment feel obscene. The bus arrived. Scarlett kissed his cheek and climbed aboard, and Dominic walked back to the apartment alone. The Honda Civic sat in its spot, rust spreading like a disease across the hood. He'd bought it used for $3,000 cash, making sure the seller thought he was scraping together his last savings. In reality, the money had come from an account that generated $3,000 in interest every 4 hours. Back inside, he showered in a bathroom where the tile was cracked and the water pressure was terrible, then changed into clothes that would have made sense for a freelance developer heading to a coffee shop to work. Clean jeans, a button-down shirt from Old Navy, sneakers that had seen better months. He packed the Dell laptop into a messenger bag that was falling apart at the seams, checked his phone one last time for messages from Elise. There were none. There hadn't been any since the divorce, and headed out. The bus ride to the financial district took 40 minutes and cost $2.50. Dominic sat near the back, surrounded by people heading to jobs that paid hourly wages and didn't come with stock options. He read a paperback sci-fi novel he'd bought from a used bookstore, and to anyone watching, he was just another struggling tech worker trying to make rent in the most expensive city in America. The bus dropped him 3 blocks from a 50-story tower of black glass that housed some of the most powerful money in Silicon Valley. He walked past it without looking up, turned down an alley, and used a key card that looked like every other corporate access badge to enter through a service entrance that bypassed the lobby entirely. The elevator required both the key card and a retinal scan. Dominic provided both. The elevator rose without stopping, expressing past floors where regular humans worked their regular jobs, and deposited him on the 42nd floor. The doors opened onto a reception area that looked like it had been designed by someone who understood that real power didn't announce itself. No marble, no gold fixtures, no ostentatious art, just clean lines, natural light, and the kind of expensive simplicity that cost more than showiness ever could. Paige Whitmore stood waiting, tablet in hand. She was 29, Stanford MBA, and had been filtering Dominic's professional life for 3 years with the kind of discretion that made her worth triple what he actually paid her. Mr. Vaughn, the board is assembled. Dr. Cross is on video link with the forensic analysis, and your 11 o'clock call to confirm Mrs. Morrison wants to discuss settlement terms. Dominic stopped walking. Elise called? Her attorney did. Kevin Hartwell from Latham and Watkins. They're offering $200 million to drop the patent opposition and sign an NDA preventing you from ever discussing Payflow's code authorship. $200 million. Once upon a time, that would have been life-changing money. Now it was just insulting. Tell Mr. Hartwell we decline. Tell him if Mrs. Morrison wants to discuss settlement, she can discuss it in federal court on June 13th. Page made a note. He implied that Ms. Morrison is prepared to go higher if needed. She could offer me the entire company and I'd still decline. This isn't about money. What is it about, sir? Dominic looked at his assistant, this woman who'd seen him in both universes, the broke freelancer and the billionaire, and never once questioned which one was real. It's about teaching someone that some things can't be bought back once you've sold them. He continued into his office, and the door closed behind him with a kind of sound that suggested it was engineered to be final. The office occupied a corner of the building with views that stretched from the Golden Gate to the Bay Bridge. Dominic had paid extra for the soundproofing, not because he needed privacy, but because he needed silence. Some men built empires in chaos. He preferred to do it where the only voice he heard was his own. The conference table was already occupied. 3 men and 2 women, all over 50, all representing the kind of institutional money that moved markets when it sneezed. They looked up as Dominic entered, and something in the room's temperature changed. This was the part where he had to be Dominic Vaughn, CEO and founder of Obsidian Capital, not the broke developer who rode the bus and read used paperbacks. The transformation took less than a second. Posture straightened. Expression hardened into something that suggested competence without arrogance. Voice dropped half an octave into registers that made people pay attention. Good morning. Thank you for adjusting your schedules. I know Tokyo's time zone is unforgiving. The woman on the video screen, representative from a Japanese pension fund that had invested $2 billion with Obsidian, nodded acknowledgement. Her expression suggested she was deciding whether to be impressed or irritated that he'd remembered. Dominic moved to the head of the table where a tablet waited, already loaded with the Sterling Tech acquisition details. Numbers scrolled past, valuation models, synergy analyses, risk assessments that went down to the decimal point. This was the work that actually mattered, not the performance art of poverty, but the architecture of moving capital in ways that created value rather than just extracting it. Sterling Tech acquisition. Purchase price, $2.4 billion. Strategic rationale. They've developed quantum-resistant encryption that will be essential in 5 years and invaluable in 10. Current revenue, negligible. Current losses, significant. But the IP is sound, the team is intact, and every major tech company will need this technology once quantum computing scaled. One of the board members, a man named Chester who'd made his first billion in semiconductors, leaned back in his chair with the kind of skepticism that came from seeing 1,000 pitches that promised the future and delivered mediocrity. Quantum-resistant encryption has been 5 years away for 15 years. What makes this different? Because Google just demonstrated a quantum computer that can break RSA 2048 in 4 hours. That news will be public in 3 weeks. Sterling Tech will be worth $10 billion by the time the market processes the implications. We're buying now before the panic. Silence. The kind that suggested money doing math. Chester's expression shifted from skepticism to something harder to read. You have inside information on Google's quantum breakthrough? I have 3 former colleagues still at Google who went quiet on social media 6 weeks ago. I have patent filings that appeared in the USPTO database showing sudden interest in post-quantum cryptography from companies that don't file patents unless they're terrified. And I have a gut that's made this fund 34% returns over 10 years. Yes or no, Chester? The man smiled, thin and cold. Yes. The rest of the votes came faster. The acquisition was approved. Papers would be signed, money would move, and somewhere in a lab, Sterling Tech's engineers would keep working without knowing their company had just changed hands. This was what actual wealth looked like. Not private jets and penthouses, though Dominic had those too. Real wealth was the ability to reshape industries before anyone noticed you were in the room. The meeting ended. The board members filed out, already on phones to their own portfolios, their own games. Page appeared in the doorway. Dr. Cross is holding on the secure line. He said you'd want to hear the full analysis directly. Dominic nodded, and she closed the door behind her. The monitor on his desk flickered to life, showing a man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of face that suggested he'd spent more time with computers than humans. Dr. Nathan Cross, MIT Professor Emeritus, forensic code analyst, and the person who could prove beyond any doubt that Elise Morrison had built her empire on stolen architecture. Dominic, you sitting down? I'm listening. The patent she filed, US 10,892,XXX, it's fraud. Not technically problematic fraud, or she should have included you, fraud, criminal fraud. 87% of Payflow's core algorithm is line-for-line match with code you wrote in March 2019. Your GitHub commits, your coding style, even your variable naming conventions. She didn't just fail to credit you, she actively erased evidence of your authorship and claimed sole inventorship on federal documents. Dominic's hands were steady on the desk, but something in his chest felt like it was compressing. Can you prove it in court? I can prove it to a jury of kindergartners. The commit timestamps alone are damning. Your work predates Payflow's incorporation by 6 weeks. Add in the email chains where she explicitly requests you fix the transaction architecture, and it's open and shut. What about the security vulnerability you mentioned? Dr. Cross's expression darkened. That's where this gets dangerous. Your original code had fail-safes, volume throttles, progressive shutdown protocols, encryption key backups. In 2022, she hired offshore contractors to add cryptocurrency support. They saw your safeguards as inefficient and stripped them out. The system will crash catastrophically under load. IPO day will generate 200,000 transactions in the first hour. The encryption key rotation will destabilize. 14 million users will have their financial data exposed. Dominic closed his eyes. Behind his eyelids, he saw the architecture he'd built, elegant and secure, gutted by people who didn't understand why certain code existed. It was like watching someone remove the foundation from a building because they wanted more parking space. Does Elise know? No, she surrounded herself with yes men who wouldn't dare tell her the system's broken. She's about to IPO on a platform that will trigger the biggest data breach in fintech history, and she has no idea. The irony was almost perfect. Elise had stolen his work, claimed sole credit, and now stood on the edge of destroying everything because she didn't actually understand what she'd stolen. It would have been poetic if 14 million people weren't about to have their lives ruined. Can it be fixed? Yes, by you. It would take maybe 72 hours of work to restore the safeguards and patch the vulnerabilities. But Dominic, if you fix it, you're helping the company that defrauded you. And if I don't, 14 million people suffer for Elise's theft. Dr. Cross was quiet for a moment. That's the moral calculus, yes. Dominic opened his eyes. The San Francisco skyline spread before him, towers built on ambition and lies, and the occasional moment of actual innovation. Somewhere out there, Elise was preparing for the IPO that would make her a billionaire. She was probably rehearsing her pitch about being a self-made founder, a woman who'd overcome sexism and doubt to build something revolutionary. And every word of it would be a lie built on his labor. I'll fix it, but I'm submitting the fix as evidence when we file the injunction. The court will see that she not only stole the original code, but corrupted it through incompetence. And when the IPO halts, the solution will be ready. The company can survive. The users can be protected. But Elise will lose everything. Yes. The words sat in the air like a verdict. Dr. Cross nodded slowly. I'll send you the technical specs. And Dominic, I'm sorry. I know you loved her once. The call ended. The monitor went dark. Dominic sat alone in his office with its views of the city and its silence that cost extra, and tried to remember what loving Elise had felt like. It was harder than it should have been. The woman he'd loved had existed for maybe 2 years, the version who'd cried in a coffee shop about her father's cruelty, who'd read bedtime stories to Scarlett with funny voices, who'd promised partnership and actually meant it. That woman had died somewhere around the time Preston Morrison passed away and left his daughter with a lifetime of inadequacy disguised as inheritance. The person who remained had Elise's face and voice, but she'd been hollowed out and filled with her father's contempt. She'd become the thing she'd feared, someone who measured worth in Forbes rankings and IPO valuations instead of human connection. His phone buzzed. A text from Scarlett, sent during lunch break. Dad, I got an A on my coding project. The teacher said my algorithm was surprisingly sophisticated for my age. I told her I learned from the best. Love you. Dominic typed back, proud of you, sweetheart. See you tonight. He set the phone down and stared at it for a long moment. This was what it was all for. Not revenge on Elise, not even justice in some abstract sense. It was about showing his daughter that some things were worth fighting for, even when fighting back was hard. Especially when fighting back was hard. The rest of the afternoon blurred past in a series of calls and meetings that required the Dominic who ran Obsidian Capital. He approved a venture round, declined 2 acquisition offers, and spent an hour on video with a founder in Austin who'd built something brilliant and needed capital without strings. This was the work he'd actually enjoyed before Elise. Finding people who were building real things and giving them the resources to succeed. No games, no tests, just the straightforward transaction of money for equity and mutual respect. At 6 o'clock, he changed back into his Walmart flannel, packed the dying Dell into his falling-apart messenger bag, and took the service elevator down to street level. The transformation was seamless. Somewhere between the 42nd floor and the lobby, the billionaire evaporated, and the struggling freelancer reappeared. Different posture, different expression, different energy. Method acting taken to its logical extreme. The bus ride home was crowded with people who'd worked long shifts and would do it again tomorrow. Dominic sat with his paperback and his careful invisibility, and wondered if any of them suspected that the man reading used science fiction had spent his afternoon moving billions. Probably not. Wealth was like that. It was invisible until you wanted to show it, and showing it was usually a mistake. Back in Daly City, he picked Scarlett up from the neighbor who watched her after school. The woman, Maria, a grandmother whose own kids had moved to cheaper states, smiled at him with the kind of sympathy reserved for single parents struggling to make it work. She's a good girl, your Scarlett. Never any trouble. Thank you, Maria. I don't know what we'd do without you. We take care of each other, yes? That's what neighbors do. Dominic handed her $40, his freelance rate for 4 hours of childcare, carefully calculated to seem generous without raising questions. In reality, he'd have paid her 10 times that and still felt like he was stealing her time. But paying market rate would have blown his cover, so he paid what a broke developer could afford and hated himself a little more. Dinner was boxed mac and cheese because that's what the receipts would show if anyone checked. Scarlett did her homework at the kitchen table while Dominic pretended to work on the Dell, actually reviewing the forensic analysis Dr. Cross had sent. The code comparisons were damning. Every major function traced back to his architecture, his decisions, his 3 days of sleepless work that had saved a failing company. Scarlett finished her homework and came to stand beside him looking at the screen. Is that about Mom, Elise? Dominic closed the laptop. Yes, sweetheart. Are you going to stop her? I'm going to tell the truth. Sometimes that's the same thing as stopping someone. She nodded, processing this with her usual gravity. Will she hate you? Probably, but I'd rather she hate me for telling the truth than love me for enabling lies. Scarlett climbed into his lap, too old for it really, but the divorce had made her younger in some ways. She smelled like school cafeteria food and strawberry shampoo. I miss when she was nice. Me too, baby, me too. They sat like that while the evening turned to night outside the kitchen window. The parking lot's fluorescent lights flickered on, painting everything in sickly yellow. The Honda Civic looked even more pathetic under that illumination. Oxidized paint, a crack spreading across the windshield, rust that suggested structural damage. It occurred to Dominic that he'd gotten so good at playing poor that he'd forgotten it was performance. The apartment had started to feel real. The bus rides had started to feel necessary. The careful budgeting and receipt saving and coupon clipping had become reflexive. He'd built a character and then moved into it so completely that sometimes he wasn't sure which version was the mask. Later, after Scarlett was asleep, he opened his laptop and pulled up the patent filing one more time. October 2019, 6 months after he'd rebuilt Payflow's entire backend. 6 months after Elise had promised they were partners. Inder, Elise Morrison. Co-inventors, none. 3 words that erased 72 hours of work. 3 words that turned partnership into theft. 3 words that would cost her everything once they got to court. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Mr. Vaughn, this is Kevin Hartwell, Mrs. Morrison's attorney. She's asked me to convey that she's willing to negotiate in good faith. The $200 million offer can be increased to $250 plus public acknowledgement as technical co-founder. She wants to avoid court. Please respond at your earliest convenience." Dominic stared at the message. $250 million. Public acknowledgement. Everything he could have claimed during the divorce, handed to him now that it was too late to matter. He typed, "Tell your client I'll see her in court. Some things can't be bought back once you've thrown them away." Sent. The message disappeared into the void. Somewhere across the city, in a penthouse that cost more per month than most people earned in a year, Elise would read those words and understand, or fail to understand, that this had never been about money. Dominic closed the laptop. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on the freeway. This was his life now. Half billionaire, half broke developer, both versions real in their own way. The question was, which version would survive what came next? He looked at the kitchen calendar where Scarlett had marked days with cheerful stickers. June 13th was circled in red marker. Court day. 28 days from now. 28 days until the truth came out and everyone learned that the broke ex-husband was actually worth more than Elise's entire company. 28 days until the test ended and the results came in. Outside, the city hummed with its usual indifference. People made money, lost money, loved each other, destroyed each other. The machinery of ambition ground on whether anyone was paying attention or not. Dominic had stopped paying attention years ago, had decided that quiet wealth was better than public success. But now he was about to become very, very public. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like relief. He shut off the lights and went to bed in a room with thrift store furniture and a window that looked out on nothing. Tomorrow he'd wake up and ride the bus and play poor again. But the clock was ticking down. The performance was almost over. Soon everyone would see what he'd been hiding, and Elise would learn what it cost to confuse silence with surrender. Some debts, it turned out, could only be paid in truth. The self-storage facility in Daly City smelled like cardboard decay, and the particular kind of regret that came from paying monthly fees to house things nobody wanted badly enough to keep close. Unit 247 sat at the end of a corridor painted institutional beige, lit by fluorescent tubes that hummed with the frequency of dying insects. The lock was rusting. The door scraped concrete when Dominic pulled it up, metal shrieking against neglect. October afternoon light filtered through dust motes thick enough to seem solid. Inside the 10 by 10 space, boxes were stacked with the careful precision of someone who'd once believed organization mattered. Christmas decorations Elise had insisted on buying from Pottery Barn, despite having nowhere to display them. Books neither of them had read, purchased because educated people own books. A leather armchair that had cost $4,000 and spent 3 years in storage because it didn't match the penthouse aesthetic. The debris of a marriage that had looked successful from the outside and rotted from within. Scarlett climbed over a box labeled Kitchen, Miscellaneous, with the fearlessness of a child who'd learned early that material possessions were temporary. She wore jeans with grass stains and a t-shirt from a coding camp Dominic had enrolled her in, using a scholarship he'd quietly funded through a shell corporation. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail that made her look even younger than 9. The storage unit had been Dominic's idea, back when the divorce was fresh and he'd still believed there might be something worth salvaging from the wreckage. He'd moved everything out in a single afternoon while Elise was at a board meeting, hiring day laborers who didn't ask questions and paid them cash from an account that existed only to maintain the illusion of poverty. The monthly fee of $125 came from the same place, a checking account that showed direct deposits of freelance income that was real enough to pass casual scrutiny, but modest enough to suggest struggle. The notice had arrived last week. Final payment missed. Clear the unit by November 1st or face auction. Dominic had missed the payment deliberately, letting the system work its bureaucratic magic. Now he had a reason to be here. On a Saturday afternoon when Scarlett should have been at a birthday party they couldn't afford to attend. She pulled at a box near the bottom of a stack, grunting with effort. "Dad, this one's heavy." Dominic moved to help, and together they dragged it into the light. The label read, "Office Supplies, 2019, in Elise's precise handwriting, back when she'd still believed in organized domesticity. Inside were the expected items: staplers, pens, legal pads turned yellow at the edges. And underneath, wrapped in a t-shirt that had belonged to Dominic's first startup, something rectangular and dense. Scarlett pulled it free. Dust clouded the air. An external hard drive, 2 terabytes, manufactured by Seagate, the kind of device that had been cutting edge in 2019 and now looked archaeological. Someone had labeled it in black Sharpie, the ink faded but legible. Payflow Alpha Build, March 2019, do not delete. Dominic's heart performed a maneuver that felt like missing a step on stairs. His hands moved without consulting his brain, taking the drive from Scarlett with the kind of care usually reserved for religious artifacts or unexploded ordnance. "What is it?" "Insurance I forgot I had." The drive was heavier than it should have been, as if the data inside had physical weight. Dominic turned it over in his hands, checking the ports, the casing, the small LED that would indicate power. Everything looked intact. The label was in his handwriting. He remembered now, 3 years ago when Elise had gone through a security paranoia phase after a competitor tried to poach her engineers. She demanded he wipe all company files from personal devices. He'd complied, but not before creating this backup and hiding it in a box of office supplies she'd never open, just in case. "Can we throw it away? We need space in the truck." "No." The word came sharper than intended. "We keep this. This is important." Scarlett accepted this with her usual equanimity, already moving to the next box. But Dominic stood frozen, holding 3 years of forgotten evidence in his hands. This drive contained everything: the original code, the email chains, the commit history that proved Payflow had been his architecture before it became Elise's empire. With this, he wouldn't just have Dr. Cross's forensic analysis. He'd have the source material itself. The afternoon passed in a blur of boxes and decisions. Keep, throw away, donate to Goodwill. Most of it was throw away. The marriage had accumulated things the way bodies accumulated scars. Evidence of damage that served no purpose once the wound closed. By 5 o'clock, they'd loaded what mattered into the borrowed pickup truck, left the rest for the facility to auction, and headed back to the apartment as the sun turned San Francisco's sky the color of warning. That night, after Scarlett went to bed with a book about a girl who coded her way out of poverty, irony that Dominic felt like a knife, he sat alone at the kitchen table and plugged the external drive into his laptop. The Dell groaned with effort, fans spinning up to jet engine volume. The drive's LED blinked green, then solid. A folder appeared on the desktop, payflow_archive_2019. Inside were 847 files. Dominic opened the first one at random. Source code scrolled past, familiar as his own handwriting because it was his own work. Comments littered throughout, initials marking decisions. D.V. Dominic Vaughn. Check encryption validation loop. Stress test under high volume. Ensure fallback protocols are redundant. He opened another file. More code, more comments, more evidence that Payflow's genius had never been Elise's. Email chains came next, exported to PDF and dated. March 12th, 2:14 in the morning. Subject line, beta crisis. Elise writing, Dominic, system crashed again. Investors pull out in 6 weeks if we don't have working demo. I don't know what to do. Please help. His response, 30 minutes later. Already started rebuild. We'll have new architecture by Friday. Trust me. March 15th, 3:07 in the morning. Beta complete. New backend handles 10 million transactions daily. Bank-grade encryption. You're going to change the world. Elise's reply sent at dawn. We are going to change the world. Partners. 50-50. I love you. The words sat on the screen like fossils, evidence of something that had once lived and now existed only as impression in stone. Dominic closed the laptop before he could read further, but his hands were shaking. Not with anger, with something worse. Grief for the version of Elise who'd written those words and meant them, who'd existed for perhaps 18 months before her father's death turned partnership into theft. The kitchen was dark except for the laptop's glow. Through the window, the parking lot lights painted everything in jaundiced yellow. The Honda Civic sat in its spot, rust spreading like cancer. Dominic looked at the car, in the apartment, in the life he'd constructed to test whether Elise could love a person instead of a portfolio. And the whole experiment suddenly felt obscene. Not because it had failed. He'd known it would fail the moment she filed the patent without his name, but because the cost of proving it had been measured in months of Scarlett's childhood, spent in a neighborhood where gunshots were ambient noise. His phone buzzed. Paige, texting at 11 on a Saturday night because people who managed $8 billion didn't get weekends. Dr. Cross uploaded full forensic report to secure server. Also, Silvergate Capital contacted me. They know about the patent dispute. They're making moves. Call when you can. Dominic typed back. Monday morning, let them wait. But sleep was impossible. He opened the laptop again and spent the next 4 hours reviewing every file on the drive. Code comparisons, architectural documents, technical specifications that bore his fingerprints in every design decision. By 3 in the morning, he'd compiled a timeline that would make prosecutors weep with joy. March 2019, Dominic rebuilds entire backend. October 2019, Elise files patent listing herself as sole inventor. November 2019, first investor meeting where she describes the algorithm she developed over 2 years of solitary work. The lies had started small and metastasized. By 2021, she was giving TechCrunch interviews about coding 18-hour days in her garage, overcoming sexism through technical brilliance, proving her father wrong about women in tech. Every word true except the part where the code was actually Dominic's. At 4 in the morning, Dominic made coffee that was too strong and sat watching dawn break over a city that had been built on lies before and would be built on lies again. The hard drive sat on the table beside the laptop, innocuous as a brick, devastating as a bomb. This was the evidence that would destroy Elise's company, end her IPO, potentially send her to federal prison for securities fraud, and he'd found it by accident, in a storage unit he'd almost let get auctioned. Fate, or whatever passed for it in a universe that didn't care about justice, had given him a weapon. The question was whether using it made him principled or just vindictive. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a call, and the time was 5:17 in the morning, which meant whoever was on the other end had either not slept or was calling from a time zone where business happened during vampire hours. "This is Vaughn." "Dominic, it's Regina." Regina Caldwell, patent attorney, the person he'd hired 3 months ago when the patent opposition became real. Her voice carried the crisp efficiency of someone who'd caffeinated past human limits. "I'm looking at the preliminary filing from Payflow's legal team. Kevin Hartwell just submitted a motion to dismiss based on community property law. He's arguing that even if you wrote the code, it was created during marriage and therefore jointly owned regardless of patent filing." Can he win on that? In California? Maybe. Community property law is strong here, but there's a wrinkle. You signed a prenup. Did you read it carefully? Dominic closed his eyes and tried to remember sitting in the lawyer's office in 2020, Elise beside him, both of them signing documents that seemed like formalities. The prenup had been her father's insistence. Protect the family assets, ensure clean separation if things went south. Dominic had signed without reading closely because he was playing broke and couldn't afford to act like someone who understood complex legal documents. "I read it." "Why?" "Because there's a clause, Section 7, subsection C, that states intellectual property created by either party during marriage remains separate property if developed independently for professional purposes. You wrote that code for Payflow, which was Elise's company, not a joint venture. The prenup actually strengthens your case. She can't claim community property on IP you developed as a contractor." Something in Dominic's chest loosened. "So the motion to dismiss fails?" "It should, but Kevin's smart. He'll pivot to arguing you were compensated fairly through joint finances during marriage. The fight isn't over, it's just moved to different terrain. We need to be ready for federal court in June with everything. And Dominic, if you have any additional evidence beyond Dr. Cross's analysis, now's the time." He looked at the hard drive sitting on the table, 847 files that would make the case unwinnable for Elise. "I have the original source files, complete codebase, email chains, commit history, everything." Regina was quiet for a beat. "Everything?" "Everything. Found it this weekend in storage. I'd made a backup years ago and forgotten." "Send it to me, encrypted." And Dominic, this changes the calculus. With those files, we're not just arguing about patent inventorship, we're documenting systematic fraud. Elise could face criminal charges. That's not the goal. "I know, but it's the leverage. Kevin Hartwell needs to understand that if this goes to trial, his client doesn't just lose the company, she loses her freedom." The call ended. Dawn had fully broken now, painting the apartment in shades of gray that suggested neither hope nor despair, but something more exhausting: inevitability. The path forward was clear. Send the files to Regina, let her build the unbeatable case, file the emergency injunction 72 hours before the IPO. Watch Elise's world collapse on live television while the market processed implications in real time. Clean, efficient, devastating. Dominic should have felt triumphant. Instead, he felt hollow, as if the months of playing poor had excavated something essential and left only the shape where purpose used to live. Scarlett emerged from her bedroom at 7, hair wild from sleep, wearing pajamas that had been washed so many times the cartoon characters were fading into abstract impressionism. "You look terrible." "Didn't sleep much." "Because of the hard drive?" Too smart, this child, too perceptive for her own good. Dominic wondered what it cost her, growing up with a father who played games with other people's lives and called it integrity. "Yes, because of the hard drive." She climbed into the chair across from him and stole a sip of his coffee, made a face at the bitterness, put it back. Are you going to use it to hurt Mom, Elise? I'm going to use it to tell the truth. Sometimes that's the same thing. But you're not doing it to be mean? No, baby. I'm doing it because 14 million people are going to have their financial data stolen if someone doesn't stop the IPO. And because letting someone profit from theft teaches the wrong lesson about how the world should work. Scarlett nodded slowly, processing this with her characteristic gravity. Will she go to jail? Maybe. I don't know. Do you want her to? Dominic looked at his daughter, 9 years old, already carrying questions that would challenge philosophy professors, and tried to find an answer that was honest without being cruel. I want her to understand what she did. I want her to face consequences, but I don't want her destroyed. There's a difference. What if there isn't? What if consequences are the same as destroying someone? Out of the mouths of children who'd watched their mother die young and their stepmother choose ambition over family. Dominic had no answer that wouldn't be a lie, so he said nothing. They sat in silence while the apartment building woke up around them. Footsteps overhead, pipes groaning, a couple arguing in Spanish about money and responsibility, and all the small ways poverty ground people down. This was real. The apartment in Daly City, the struggling neighbors, the weight of being one missed paycheck from catastrophe. And Dominic had been pretending to live it while having the financial escape hatch that made it performance instead of prison. The guilt of that particular privilege sat in his stomach like undigested meat. Monday came faster than it should have. Dominic dropped Scarlett at school, rode the bus to the financial district, took the service elevator to the 42nd floor. But this time the transformation felt incomplete, as if the broke developer and the billionaire were bleeding together into something that couldn't quite pass for either. Paige met him with coffee and concern. You look rough, sir. Bad weekend. What's Silvergate Capital want? They want a meeting, today if possible. They've been watching the payflow situation and they smell blood in the water. Clark Brennan is their lead partner. Used to be a federal prosecutor, specialized in white-collar crime. He knows about the patent dispute and he's interested in discussing strategic opportunities. Translation. Silvergate wanted to buy Payflow at bankruptcy prices after Dominic torpedoed the IPO, and they wanted him to know they could make it worth his while. This was how the real money worked, not through fair competition, but through controlled demolition, followed by asset stripping. Dominic had done it himself a dozen times, acquiring companies that had destroyed themselves through incompetence or fraud, and rebuilding them into something functional. But this was different. This was Elise. Tell Brennan I'll meet him Thursday, not before, and only if he understands I'm not interested in financial arrangements. I want user data protected and company assets preserved. If he can guarantee that, we'll talk. Paige made notes, her expression suggesting she knew there was more to the story, but was too professional to ask. I'll set it up. Also, Dr. Cross called. He's analyzed the patch Payflow issued for the security vulnerability. It doesn't work. He says the system will fail catastrophically on IPO day unless someone who actually understands your architecture fixes it properly. I know. I'm planning to code the fix myself and submit it with the court filing. When the injunction halts the IPO, the solution will be ready. The company survives, users are protected, but Elise faces consequences for the fraud. That's very noble, sir. It's also strategically complex. If you provide the fix, Payflow could argue you're still invested in the company's success and use that to undermine your patent claims. Dominic hadn't considered that angle. Of course, Elise's lawyers would twist mercy into evidence of ulterior motive. That was how the system worked. Kindness became weakness, integrity became strategy, and every decent impulse got weaponized by people who'd forgotten that some things mattered more than winning. Note the concern. We'll address it with Regina. Anything else? Your 11 o'clock canceled, so did your 2 o'clock, and your 4:15. Every meeting today canceled within the past hour. Something cold moved through Dominic's chest. Why? The cancellation emails are polite but vague. My guess? Word is spreading about the patent dispute. People are treating you like you're radioactive until they see which way this resolves. This was the cost of going to war with someone who had better PR. Elise's crisis management team, the same firm that had rehabilitated the image of a pharmaceutical company after they'd raised insulin prices by 400%, was already working to isolate him, paint him as a bitter ex-husband seeking attention, a failed developer trying to steal credit, a man whose word couldn't be trusted because he'd lied about his own wealth. Never mind that the lie had been designed to test her character. The narrative machine didn't care about nuance. Dominic spent the day in his office, doing the work that couldn't wait, approving wire transfers, reviewing quarterly reports, making the thousand small decisions that kept Obsidian Capital functioning. But concentration was impossible. His mind kept returning to the hard drive, to the files that would detonate Elise's life, to Scarlett's question, "Do you want her to go to jail?" The honest answer was no. He wanted her to admit what she'd done, to face the humans she'd endangered, to understand that theft carried consequences. But prison? Years in a federal facility, stripped of everything that made her feel successful, turned into case study for ambitious women who confused excellence with ruthlessness? That wasn't justice. That was just cruelty with paperwork. At 6 o'clock, Dominic left the office and rode the bus home through rush-hour traffic that moved like molasses in winter. The Honda Civic was still there, still rusting, still serving as prop in the performance art of poverty. He sat inside it for 10 minutes, engine off, watching other people return to lives that were actually hard rather than performance. A woman carried groceries in both hands, shopping bags cutting into her palms because she couldn't afford the delivery fee. A man limped toward his apartment, knee wrapped in a brace that suggested medical bills he couldn't pay. Real struggle, not the theatrical version Dominic had been staging. His phone buzzed. Text from a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Vaughn, this is Kevin Hartwell. I believe we should speak directly, attorney to principal. My client is willing to settle this matter immediately for $300 million plus full public recognition as co-inventor. She wants to avoid court and the damage it would cause. Please respond." 300 million, up from 250, which had been up from 200. The price of Elise's panic, measured in increments of $50 million. Once upon a time, that much money would have changed Dominic's life so completely he'd have become a different person. Now it was just insulting in a more expensive way. He typed, "Tell your client that some things can't be bought back once you've sold them. The price of integrity isn't measured in dollars. See you in court." Sent. Deleted the thread, dropped the phone in the cup holder and stared at the apartment building where he'd been pretending to struggle for 5 years. The performance was almost over. In 26 days, everyone would know who he really was. In 26 days, Elise would stand in federal court and watch her empire dissolve like sugar and acid. In 26 days, the truth would come out, and he'd finally learn whether teaching that lesson had been worth the cost. Scarlett was waiting inside, homework spread across the kitchen table. She looked up when he entered, and something in her expression suggested she'd been worrying. "Dad, kids at school are talking. They saw something online about payflow and lawsuits. They asked if you're suing my mom." I didn't know what to say. Dominic sat across from her, suddenly exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with sleep. "What did you tell them?" "That grown-ups sometimes have complicated disagreements. Was that okay?" "That was perfect, sweetheart. I'm sorry this is touching your life. You shouldn't have to explain adult mistakes." "Is Mom Elise going to be okay?" "I don't know. Maybe not the way she defines okay, but hopefully she'll be okay in ways that matter more." Scarlett nodded like this made sense, though it probably didn't. They made dinner together, pasta with jarred sauce, garlic bread from the freezer section, food that tasted like what it cost. While they ate, Dominic's phone buzzed repeatedly, messages piling up, probably from people who'd heard about the patent dispute and wanted to either offer support or distance themselves. He didn't check. The buzzing was answer enough. That night, after Scarlett slept, Dominic returned to the hard drive. He opened a file at random, technical specifications for the encryption protocol, and found himself reading his own work from 5 years ago like it was archaeology. The code was elegant, efficient, built with the kind of care that came from understanding not just what you were building, but why it mattered. This was what actual craftsmanship looked like before it got corrupted by people who saw only the market value. Elise had taken this work and claimed it as her own, then let incompetent contractors gut it because she didn't understand what she'd stolen. That was the real crime. Not just the theft, but the degradation of something that had been built with integrity. Like buying a Stradivarius and using it for firewood. His phone rang, 3 in the morning, which meant either emergency or someone calling from Asia, where business hours were different. The caller ID showed Regina Caldwell. "Dominic, we need to talk about timeline. I just got off the phone with the clerk's office. Judge Whitmore moved our hearing up. We're not filing the injunction 72 hours before the IPO. We're filing it in 8 days. Why? Because Payflow's legal team filed a motion claiming your patent opposition is strategic harassment designed to manipulate stock prices. They want the case dismissed before IPO to prevent market confusion. Judge Whitmore wants to hear arguments immediately. Can we be ready? With the files you sent me? Yes. But Dominic, this changes everything. We won't have time to negotiate. We won't have time to let Elise consider settlement. We're going straight to court with nuclear evidence, and she'll have maybe 48 hours to understand what's about to hit her. Will that hurt our case? No, but it might hurt her more than you intended. No time to prepare, no time to spin the narrative. She's going to get destroyed in public with zero warning." Something in Dominic's chest felt like it was compressing. This was what he'd wanted: justice, consequences, truth. But the timeline made it feel less like strategy and more like ambush. 8 days. Not enough time for Elise to mount a proper defense, just enough for her to watch everything collapse in slow motion. We proceed as planned, file when the court allows. Understood. And Dominic? Clark Brennan from Silvergate called me directly. He wants you to know they're ready to move the moment Payflow's stock tanks. They'll acquire the company, install new management, implement your security fixes. Users protected, company survives, but Elise loses everything. He's offering you 30% equity in the restructured company. Tell him I'm not interested in profiting from this. Tell him I'll consult on the security fixes for free if it means users are protected, but I don't want equity. He's not going to understand that. He doesn't have to. Just deliver the message. The call ended. Dominic sat in the dark apartment with its thrift store furniture and its window that looked out on nothing, and tried to remember why this had seemed like a good idea. Testing Elise by playing poor, letting her reveal her character through the choices she made when she thought he was powerless. It had worked. She'd failed spectacularly, stolen his work, chosen status over partnership. But winning the test didn't make him feel vindicated. It just made him tired. 8 days, 220 hours until everyone learned the truth. The countdown had begun whether he was ready or not. Morning came gray and reluctant. Dominic dropped Scarlett at school, fielded her questions about whether the lawsuit meant they'd move back to a nice neighborhood. "Not yet, baby. These things take time," and made his way to the financial district through fog that turned the city into suggestion rather than substance. The office felt different now that the timeline had compressed. Paige moved with increased urgency, fielding calls and coordinating with Regina's firm. Dr. Cross sent updated security analyses. Bradford Hayes, the securities attorney, started preparing documentation for the SEC investigation that would inevitably follow the injunction. Dominic sat in his office and did something he hadn't done in years. pulled up Elise's social media. Her Instagram showed the careful curation of someone building a personal brand. Photos from speaking engagements where she talked about overcoming sexism in tech. Video clips of her ringing the opening bell at various exchanges during practice runs. Selfies with other female founders. Captions about solidarity and breaking glass ceilings. The comments were universally supportive. Thousands of people praising her courage, her brilliance, her refusal to let men define her worth. None of them knew the empire was built on stolen architecture. None of them understood that the woman they were celebrating had become exactly what she'd feared. Someone who measured success in acquisitions rather than integrity. One photo stopped him cold. Elise with Scarlett, taken 2 years ago at the aquarium. His daughter smiling at the camera while Elise's hand rested on her shoulder. Both of them genuinely happy in a way that suggested the woman who'd read bedtime stories still existed somewhere under the CEO armor. The caption, "Family day with this brilliant girl," teaching her that women can code, can lead, can build empires. The future is bright. Dominic stared at the photo until his eyes burned. This was what made the whole situation impossible. Elise wasn't a villain, just a wounded person who'd made terrible choices because she'd confused achievement with worthiness. She'd been kind once. She'd loved Scarlett genuinely. She'd promised partnership and meant it, right up until the moment her father's death made her doubt everything. But intentions didn't erase fraud. Good moments didn't offset theft. And 14 million users were about to have their financial data exposed because Elise had surrounded herself with yes men instead of people who'd tell her the truth. The week blurred past in preparation. Regina's team built the case with the kind of thoroughness that suggested they were preparing for war rather than litigation. Every email was cataloged, every code commit analyzed, every inconsistency in Elise's public statements documented. By Friday afternoon, they had a filing that read less like legal argument and more like prosecution. Dominic read it in his office while the city disappeared into weekend mode around him. The document was devastating, clinical, precise, and absolutely damning. It proved beyond question that Elise had committed patent fraud, securities fraud, and potentially criminal theft of intellectual property. With the evidence from the hard drive, there was no defense. She'd lose the case, lose the company, probably face criminal charges. He should have felt satisfied. Instead, he felt like he was reading a death sentence for someone he'd once loved. His phone buzzed. Text from Scarlett, staying with the neighbor for a Friday movie night. "Dad, there's a news thing on TV about Payflow. They're talking about you. Are you famous now?" Not yet, he thought, but soon. In 72 hours, the injunction would be filed and his name would become public. The broke ex-husband would be revealed as a billionaire, and everyone would understand that the narrative they'd been fed was fiction. He typed back, "Not famous, just visible. There's a difference. Love you, sweetheart." The weekend passed in a haze of final preparations. Regina called Saturday morning to confirm they were filing Monday at dawn. The court date was set for Wednesday, 2 days for the world to process the allegations before the hearing where everything would be decided. Sunday evening, Dominic sat alone in the apartment and pulled up the patent filing one last time. US 10,892,XXX. Inventor, Elise Morrison. Co-inventors, none. 3 words that had seemed like minor omission 5 years ago and had metastasized into fraud that would destroy everything she'd built. 3 words that proved the person you became when you thought nobody was watching. His phone rang. Unknown number, which usually meant robocalls or creditors chasing someone who'd previously had this number. But something made him answer. "This is Vaughn." "Dominic," Elise's voice, raw in a way he'd never heard. "Kevin doesn't know I'm calling. I know I'm not supposed to contact you directly, but I need you to hear this from me. I'm listening. I made mistakes, terrible mistakes. The patent should have had your name. The credit should have been shared. I let my father's voice in my head drown out what was right. And I'm sorry. I'm so, so sorry. The words hung between them like smoke. Dominic could picture her, probably in the penthouse, probably alone because Garrett was the kind of man who disappeared when situations became complicated. She'd be wearing something expensive that no longer made her feel successful, staring at a view that had stopped meaning anything. Why are you calling? Because I saw Scarlett's school photo on my feed. Instagram memory from 3 years ago. She's so much bigger now. I miss that. I chose the company over being her mother, and I missed watching her grow up. That's not something I can buy back. No, it isn't. I know you're filing the injunction Monday, Kevin told me. He said with the evidence you have, we can't win. The IPO will cancel. The company will collapse. I'll probably face criminal charges, and I deserve all of it. But Dominic, please, not for me. For the 520 employees who have families. For the users who depend on the platform. Don't destroy something that took years to build just to prove a point. I'm not destroying it. I'm correcting the record. And I've already coded the security fixes. When the injunction halts the IPO, the solution will be ready. The company can survive under new management. Users will be protected. But you don't get to keep credit for work you didn't do. Silence. He could hear her breathing, ragged and desperate. I loved you once, genuinely, before everything got complicated. I know, I loved you too. But love doesn't excuse theft. And the woman I loved wouldn't have stolen credit in the first place. She died when my father did. I'm sorry you got stuck with what was left. The line went dead. Dominic sat holding the phone, feeling like he'd just watched someone step off a ledge in slow motion. Elise wasn't calling to negotiate. She was calling to say goodbye to the version of herself who'd once been worthy of partnership. Monday morning arrived with the kind of relentless inevitability usually reserved for weather systems and terminal diagnoses. Dominic rode the bus to the financial district one last time in his Walmart flannel, carrying the laptop that had served as prop in 5 years of performance art. But this ride felt different, as if the costume no longer fit properly. Other passengers watched him with expressions suggesting they'd seen his face somewhere but couldn't place it. One woman made eye contact, and her expression shifted from recognition to confusion to embarrassment, and Dominic understood. The news was already leaking. Regina had filed at 6 in the morning. By 8, Tech Press had the story. By 9, it was trending nationwide. By the time Dominic reached his office, Paige was fielding calls from reporters who wanted comment on the billionaire who'd hidden in plain sight for 5 years. What should I tell them? Tell them I'll make a statement after Wednesday's hearing. Until then, no comment. But the silence wouldn't matter. The narrative machine was already running, processing the story into digestible chunks for mass consumption. Dominic checked Twitter, because of course he checked Twitter. Humans were predictable that way, and watched the discourse evolve in real time. Some people called him a genius, playing the long game, testing his wife's character, proving that wealth didn't define worth. Others called him manipulative, cruel, a man who'd gaslit his wife by pretending to be poor while actually being rich enough to destroy her. The truth, as usual, lives somewhere in the uncomfortable middle, where nuance made for bad headlines. One tweet caught his attention, retweeted 16,000 times. Dominic Vaughn spent 5 years LARPing as poor to test his wife, then destroyed her career when she failed his test. This isn't justice. This is abuse with better PR. The words felt like a punch. Was that what he'd done? Built an elaborate trap and then sprung it with maximum damage? The intention had been different. Learn whether Elise could love him without the distortion money created. But intentions didn't erase consequences. He'd played God with her life, and now she'd pay the price. Wednesday arrived faster than time should have allowed. The morning was sharp and clear. One of those San Francisco days where the light made everything look important. Dominic, dressed in the Tom Ford suit, adjusted the Patek Philippe, transformed fully into the version of himself who was worth $640 million. The broke developer had served his purpose. Now it was time to show the world what he'd been hiding. The Rolls-Royce picked him up at the apartment. Neighbors stared. The car cost more than most of them would earn in a lifetime. An old woman he'd chatted with about grocery prices looked at him with an expression that mixed betrayal and understanding. He'd been lying to them too, performing poverty while having escape hatches they'd never access. The guilt of that particular privilege would take longer to process than the divorce. Scarlett sat beside him in the car, wearing a navy dress that made her look older. She'd insisted on attending the hearing despite Dominic's protests. "I want to see what truth looks like when it costs something," she'd said. And what could he say to that? Manhattan materialized around them as the car crossed into the city proper. Glass towers reaching toward sky that didn't care about human ambition. The federal courthouse appeared ahead, and with it the media circus that had been assembling since dawn. Cameras, reporters, curious observers who smelled blood and wanted to watch the feeding. This was the moment. The performance ending, the truth beginning. Dominic stepped out of the Rolls-Royce into light that felt like judgment, and every camera in the world turned to face him. The courthouse steps might as well have been a stage, spotlit by morning sun and the hunger of 80 cameras that had assembled to document collapse. Dominic moved through the attention like he'd been doing it all his life, which in some parallel version of events he had. Board meetings, investor presentations, the thousand small performances that came with managing billions. But this was different. This was public. This was permanent. A reporter from Bloomberg thrust forward, microphone extended like a weapon. "Mr. Vaughn, Miss Morrison claimed you were a struggling freelancer. How long have you been worth over $500 million?" The question hung in air that smelled like exhaust and ambition. Dominic stopped on the step, turned to face the assembled press. Scarlett's hand found his, small and warm and trusting in ways he probably didn't deserve. "I was never poor. 5 years ago, after my first wife died chasing status that killed her, I chose to live simply. I wanted to know if the woman I love could see past wealth to the person underneath. She couldn't. And when she stole my work and claimed it as her own, she proved that some tests you fail by not knowing you're being tested." The cameras loved it. Already he could see phones out, recording, the clip destined to be dissected and debated and turned into content for people who confused watching drama with living lives. But the words were true, and truth was all he had left that felt real. Today isn't revenge. It's about protecting 14 million users whose financial data will be exposed if Payflow's IPO proceeds with a broken system. It's about defending the principle that theft carries consequences, even when the thief is sympathetic. Elise Morrison isn't evil. She's scared. But fear doesn't excuse fraud. He turned back toward the courthouse, done performing. Behind him, the reporters erupted with follow-up questions that became noise without meaning. Scarlett squeezed his hand. "That was good, Dad. You didn't sound angry." "I'm not angry anymore, just tired." The courthouse interior was all marble and implied authority, the kind of architecture designed to make humans feel small against the weight of law. Security checkpoint, metal detectors, the ritual of emptying pockets and proving you weren't dangerous. Dominic passed through with the ease of someone who had nothing to hide anymore. The Patek Philippe went in a plastic tray, came out the other side worth more than the security guard's annual salary. The inequality of it felt obscene. Regina Caldwell waited past security, briefcase in hand, an expression suggesting she'd been awake for 30 hours straight. Her suit was impeccable, her hair pulled back with the severity of someone preparing for combat. She looked at Dominic and Scarlett with something that might have been concern. "The courtroom's filling fast." Elise arrived 10 minutes ago with her full legal team. 6 attorneys from Latham, plus 2 crisis management consultants. They're preparing for war. Let them prepare. We have evidence. They have narratives. Narratives matter in court. Kevin Hartwell is good. He'll paint you as vindictive, manipulative, a man who engineered his wife's downfall because she dared to be successful. The fact that you hid your wealth gives him ammunition. Dominic absorbed this without flinching. He'd known from the beginning that honesty would be weaponized, that every choice he'd made could be reframed as manipulation. That was how the system worked: turn truth into strategy, make integrity look like calculation. How bad will it get? Depends on whether Garrett Ashford shows up. If he testifies the way Silvergate wants him to, Elise loses everything today. If he stays silent, this becomes a longer fight. They moved toward the courtroom, footsteps echoing on marble that had absorbed a century of verdict and consequence. Other people filled the halls: lawyers, defendants, families watching their futures get decided by judges who'd never met them. The machinery of justice grinding forward whether anyone was ready or not. Courtroom 7B was already three-quarters full, every seat occupied by someone who decided this particular drama was worth witnessing. Dominic scanned faces and found mostly strangers, but a few stood out. Tech journalists with their notebooks and cynical expressions, investors who'd backed Payflow and now watched their money evaporate in real time. And near the back, wearing sunglasses indoors like disguise mattered, Preston Morrison's widow, Constance, Elise's mother, the woman who'd looked at Dominic with contempt during family dinners because he wasn't impressive enough to deserve her daughter. Their eyes met. She removed the sunglasses, and what looked back at him wasn't contempt anymore, just profound sadness, as if she'd finally understood that pushing her daughter toward success had pushed her toward fraud. The front row on the right held Elise in her legal battalion. She wore navy Armani that probably cost what the security guard made in 3 months. Her hair pulled back in a style that suggested control despite the situation unraveling around her. When she turned and saw Dominic, something complex moved across her face. Recognition, regret, rage, resignation. All of it true, none of it enough to change what came next. Beside her sat Kevin Hartwell, 62 and emanating the kind of confidence that came from winning cases that should have been lost. He was currently speaking into Elise's ear, probably coaching her on expression and posture, making sure the jury of public opinion would see a woman under siege rather than a thief facing consequences. But there was no jury here. Judge Patricia Whitmore would decide alone, and she had a reputation for caring more about evidence than performance. Dominic took his seat beside Regina, Scarlett on his other side. His own focus was scattered across 100 anxieties that all boiled down to the same question: would truth matter more than narrative when the verdict came? The bailiff entered and performed the ritual. All rise. The United States District Court for the Southern District of New York is now in session. The Honorable Patricia Whitmore presiding. Everyone stood. The judge emerged from chambers, 64 years old and carrying herself like someone who'd stopped being impressed by wealth or status sometime in the previous century. She wore her robes the way soldiers wore uniforms, functionally, without ceremony. Her expression suggested she'd reviewed the filings and found them more interesting than most. Please be seated. Case number 23CV 4719, Vaughn versus Morrison. Counsel, are you ready to proceed? Regina stood. Ready, Your Honor. Kevin Hartwell rose with practiced ease. Ready, Your Honor. Before we begin, I want to establish parameters. This is a preliminary injunction hearing, not a full trial. I'm deciding whether to halt Payflow's IPO pending resolution of patent inventorship claims. Ms. Caldwell, you're alleging fraud. That's a serious accusation requiring serious evidence. I hope you're prepared. We are, Your Honor, extremely prepared. The judge nodded, satisfied. Then let's proceed. Ms. Caldwell, opening statement. Regina moved to the podium with her notes, though Dominic suspected she'd memorized every word. Her voice when it came was clear and cold, the kind of tone that suggested facts rather than emotion. Your Honor, in March 2019, Dominic Vaughn spent 72 hours rebuilding Payflow Technologies' entire back-end architecture. He wrote 47,000 lines of code that transformed a failing startup into a platform capable of processing 10 million transactions daily with bank-grade encryption. 6 months later, Elise Morrison filed patent US 10,892 XXX, listing herself as sole inventor. She erased Mr. Vaughn from the record and built a $10 billion empire on his stolen architecture. She clicked a remote. The screen behind her lit up with code comparison, 2 columns running parallel. On the left, Dominic's GitHub commits from March 2019. On the right, Payflow's current production system. Highlighted sections showed 87% direct match. This isn't collaboration, this is theft. The timestamps prove Mr. Vaughn's work predates Payflow's incorporation. The email chains prove Mrs. Morrison explicitly requested he rebuild the transaction architecture. The code itself proves everything that matters. But there's more. Another click. Security vulnerability analysis filled the screen. Technical diagrams showing encryption failure cascades. In 2022, Ms. Morrison hired offshore contractors to update the code. They removed critical safeguards Mr. Vaughn had engineered. The result is a system that will catastrophically fail under high load. On IPO day, when transaction volume spikes, 14 million users will have their financial data exposed. Ms. Morrison claims she's the architect, but she doesn't understand what she built well enough to know it's broken. Regina paused, let the implications settle like dust after demolition. We're requesting immediate halt to the IPO, correction of patent inventorship, and SEC investigation into securities fraud. Ms. Morrison didn't just steal credit, she's attempting to take a company public on a platform she knows, or should know, is fundamentally compromised. She sat. The courtroom held its silence like breath. Kevin Hartwell stood, and the temperature in the room shifted. He was good. You could see it in the way he owned the space, turning toward the judge with expression that suggested disappointment rather than aggression. Your Honor, this is indeed a serious matter. But what Ms. Caldwell describes as theft, the law recognizes as marriage. Mr. and Ms. Vaughn Morrison were married from 2020 to 2023. During that marriage, they collaborated on Payflow. Mr. Vaughn contributed technical expertise. Ms. Morrison contributed business strategy, fundraising, and the vision that transformed code into company. This is how marriages work. Complementary skills building something together. He gestured toward Dominic without looking at him directly. But here's what Ms. Caldwell conveniently omits. Mr. Vaughn signed a divorce settlement in January 2023, explicitly waiving all claims to marital property, including intellectual property rights. He walked away clean. And now, 72 hours before an IPO that will create jobs and wealth, he decides he's been wronged? This isn't about justice. It's about a bitter ex-husband who can't handle his former wife's success. Kevin let that hang, then delivered the counterpunch. Moreover, we've discovered that Mr. Vaughn lied about his financial status throughout the marriage and divorce. He claimed poverty while actually controlling over $600 million in assets. He manipulated everyone, his wife, the court, even the public, by pretending to be something he wasn't. And now he comes before you claiming he's the victim? Your Honor, this is manipulation masquerading as principle. We request immediate dismissal. He sat. The courtroom remained silent, but Dominic could feel the shift. Kevin was good because he'd identified the vulnerable angle. Dominic's deception gave ammunition to anyone who wanted to question his motives. Playing poor had been strategy, but strategy looked like manipulation when described by skilled counsel. Judge Whitmore surveyed both legal teams with expression, suggesting she was computing variables in real time. I want to hear testimony before ruling. Ms. Caldwell, call your first witness. We call Dominic Vaughn. Walking to the witness stand felt like moving through water, each step requiring more effort than it should. The bailiff administered oath, and Dominic placed his hand on something that purported to be sacred and promised to tell truth he'd been telling all along. The judge watched with eyes that had evaluated 1,000 liars and probably knew how to spot number 1001. Regina approached with her measured grace. Mr. Vaughn, please describe your background. Bachelor's in computer science from Stanford, master's from MIT, worked at Google as senior engineer before founding Obsidian Capital in 2012. We manage approximately $8 billion in assets. And your net worth? $640 million, approximately. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The number was abstract until you said it aloud. Then it became real enough to make people recalculate everything they thought they understood about power dynamics. When you met Elise Morrison in 2019, did you disclose your wealth? No. Why not? Dominic looked past Regina to where Elise sat, watching him with expression he couldn't quite parse. This was the moment to explain, to make people understand that the deception had been test rather than trap. But explanations were dangerous. They invited judgment on whether the test had been fair. My first wife died from illness caused by chronic stress. She spent our marriage pursuing status, bigger house, luxury lifestyle, keeping up with wealth she felt entitled to. It destroyed her health. After she passed, I decided I'd never let money corrupt another relationship. When I met Elise, I lived simply to see if she could love the person rather than the portfolio. And what did you discover? That she couldn't. That when her father died and left her feeling inadequate, she chose status over partnership. She stole my work because admitting collaboration felt like weakness. Regina nodded, moved to the next point. Tell the court about March 2019. Payflow was failing. Beta testing crashed under any real load. Elise's investors were threatening to pull Series A funding. She asked if I could help. I spent 72 hours rebuilding the entire back-end. New architecture, bank-grade encryption, systems that could scale to millions of transactions. I did it because I loved her and believed we were partners. Did Ms. Morrison promise to include you as co-inventor on patent filings? She promised we were building something together. 50-50, she said. I trusted that meant credit would be shared. When did you learn otherwise? September 2021. Google Alert notified me she'd filed patent listing herself as sole inventor. I confronted her. She claimed it was legal strategy to avoid nepotism appearance. I believed her because I was still trying to save the marriage. Regina displayed the patent document on screen, making sure everyone could see the damning simplicity. Inventor, Elise Morrison. Co-inventors, none. Mr. Vaughn, why are you pursuing this now? Because 14 million users are about to have their financial data exposed by a system Elise corrupted through ignorance. Because letting theft succeed teaches the wrong lesson about integrity. And because my daughter is watching, learning what it means to stand up when standing up is hard. The words came out more raw than intended. Regina nodded, satisfied, returned to her seat. Kevin Hartwell approached with the predatory ease of someone who'd identified blood in water. Mr. Vaughn, you claim you lived simply. Let's examine that claim. You drove a Honda Civic? Yes. Shopped with coupons? Yes. Rode public buses? Yes. All while having $640 million available? Yes. That's not living simply, Mr. Vaughn. That's performance art. You were playing poor while people around you actually struggled. How is that not manipulation? The question landed like a fist. Dominic had asked himself the same thing during 5 years of pretending, but hearing it in court made the guilt sharper. I was testing whether someone could love me without money distorting the relationship. By lying to everyone around you? By making your neighbors think you were one of them while having wealth they'll never access? That's not testing, that's cruelty. Maybe. The admission surprised even Dominic. Maybe it was both. Kevin blinked, thrown by the concession. Witnesses weren't supposed to agree with attacks, but Dominic was exhausted of defending choices that felt more questionable with every passing month. You signed a divorce settlement waiving all claims to intellectual property, correct? Correct. Why? Because at the time, I believed walking away with nothing was more dignified than fighting over assets I didn't need. But now you're fighting. What changed? I found evidence of fraud, and I realized 14 million people would suffer if I stayed silent. Kevin's expression suggested he didn't believe a word. How convenient that you discovered this fraud exactly 72 hours before an IPO that will make your ex-wife a billionaire. The timing doesn't strike you as suspicious? The timing was dictated by when I found the backup files. If I'd found them sooner, I would have acted sooner. Or perhaps you waited until the moment that would cause maximum damage. Perhaps this isn't about protecting users. It's about ensuring Elise Morrison's success becomes her punishment. The question hung in air, gone sharp with implication. Dominic looked at Kevin Hartwell and saw a man doing his job, defending a client through whatever means available, truth or otherwise. But the accusation stung because some part of it might be accurate. I don't know. Maybe there's no purely good motive for any of this. Maybe the best I can claim is that my complicated reasons still lead to necessary consequences. Kevin seemed unsure whether he'd won or lost that exchange. He returned to his seat without further questions, and Dominic stepped down feeling like he'd confessed to crimes he hadn't quite committed. Judge Whitmore looked at the clock, then at both legal teams. We'll take 30 minutes. When we return, I want to hear from Ms. Morrison. The recess was chaos, conducted in formal setting. Dominic and Regina retreated to a consultation room where Scarlett sat reading, apparently unbothered by the fact that her father's life was being evaluated for public consumption. Regina paced, energy barely contained. That was good. The admission about manipulation, that was unexpected but smart, made you human instead of calculating. It wasn't strategy. I actually don't know if what I did was right. Right doesn't matter. Regina laughed, surprised and delighted. Your daughter's smarter than most judges I know. She learned from better teachers than me. They returned to the courtroom as the 30 minutes expired. The gallery had filled further, people somehow squeezing into spaces that shouldn't have existed. Word had spread that this was the spectacle worth watching. Billionaire versus billionaire, both claiming victimhood, only one telling truth. Judge Whitmore resumed her position, expressions suggesting she'd spent recess reviewing evidence rather than resting. Ms. Morrison, please take the stand. Elise stood with practiced grace, moving toward the witness box like she'd rehearsed the walk. But something in her posture had changed since morning. Shoulders slightly forward, chin not quite as high. The armor was cracking. When she sat and placed her hand on the Bible, her fingers trembled just enough for anyone watching closely to notice. Kevin Hartwell approached with the careful concern of someone handling crystal. Ms. Morrison, how would you describe your relationship with Dominic Vaughn during your marriage? Complicated. Her voice was steadier than her hands. We loved each other once, genuinely, but Dominic was different than I thought. He lived small, thought small. Who created it? I conceived the vision. I understood what the market needed, fast transactions without sacrificing security. Dominic helped implement my specifications. He's technically skilled, but the architecture, the business logic, the innovation, that was mine. The lie was smooth enough to sound plausible if you didn't know code. She displayed email on the screen, dated March 14th, 2019. From Elise to Dominic, 3 a.m. System crashed again. I don't understand why. Please fix. We have 6 weeks or we're dead. Does that sound like you understood the technical architecture? I understood the business requirements. Here's another email, same night. Your exact words. I don't know what to do. I'm not technical enough to debug this. You're the only one who can save us. Elise's composure fractured slightly. That was, I was stressed. Hyperbole. Let's look at the patent filing. Regina switched to the official USPTO document. You listed yourself as sole inventor. Did you write the code? I oversaw its creation. That's not what I asked. Did your hands type the 47,000 lines that became Payflow's core algorithm? Silence. Elise looked at Kevin, who remained carefully neutral. Mr. Vaughn implemented my vision. So no, you didn't write the code, yet you filed federal documents claiming sole inventorship. That's fraud, Miss Morrison. I built the company, I raised the money, I created the strategy. But you didn't invent the algorithm. Ms. Morrison, one final question. Your father, Preston Morrison, died in late 2022, correct? A few months before your divorce? Elise's face went pale. Yes, November 2022. Stroke. And Elise, on IPO day, when transaction volume spikes, 14 million users will have their data exposed. You're about to cause the largest breach in fintech history because you stole architecture you don't understand. Elise stared at the technical diagrams like they were written in a language she'd never learned, which, Dominic realized, they were. Step down, Miss Morrison. Elise returned to her seat, moving like someone concussed. Kevin leaned close, but she seemed beyond hearing. The courtroom doors opened. Garrett Ashford entered, and every head turned. He moved with purpose toward the witness stand. Elise saw him, and relief flooded her features. Here was the ally who would save her. But Dominic saw something else in Garrett's expression, the set of his jaw, the way he wouldn't meet Elise's eyes. Mr. Ashford, Judge Whitmore called, I understand you have testimony? I do, Your Honor. He was sworn in, sat, and delivered his lines with the precision of someone who'd rehearsed. State your relationship to the parties. I'm COO of Payflow Technologies. I was also in a personal relationship with Ms. Morrison. Past tense on both counts, as of this morning. Elise's face drained of all color. In November 2022, Ms. Morrison told me explicitly that Dominic Vaughn had written Payflow's core algorithm. She called him her secret weapon. She said investors wouldn't respect a married founding team, so she needed sole credit. Garrett, no! Elise's voice broke. Judge Whitmore's gavel came down. Ms. Morrison, one more word and I hold you in contempt. Garrett continued without emotion. In January 2023, she directed me to move $280 million to Cayman accounts. The purpose was hiding assets from divorce settlement. I have documentation. I've also agreed to cooperate with the SEC investigation in exchange for immunity. Why testify now? Silvergate Capital offered me the CEO position when they acquire Payflow at distressed prices. My cooperation was the condition. The honesty was almost refreshing. No pretense of nobility, just naked self-interest. Judge Whitmore dismissed him. Garrett left without looking back. Elise watched him go with expression, suggesting her capacity for surprise had finally been exhausted. I've heard enough, the judge's voice cut through the silence. This case presents complicated questions, but some facts are simple. Ms. Morrison filed a patent listing herself as sole inventor of an algorithm she admits she didn't personally code. That's fraudulent misrepresentation. Mr. Vaughn has provided overwhelming evidence of authorship. The security vulnerability is real and urgent. She looked directly at Elise. Therefore, I'm issuing preliminary injunction. Payflow's IPO is halted effective immediately. Patent US 10,892,000 XXX is suspended. I'm referring this matter to the SEC and FBI for investigation. Ms. Morrison, retain criminal counsel. This court is adjourned. The gavel fell with the sound of finality. The courtroom erupted. Dominic stood, feeling nothing resembling triumph. Scarlett took his hand. We won? Yes, but it doesn't feel the way I expected. They moved toward the exit. At the door, Dominic turned back once. Elise sat surrounded by attorneys, but utterly alone. Their eyes met across the distance and something passed between them, understanding that they'd both failed each other in different ways, that there were no clean victories in wars fought over stolen trust. Outside, cameras waited. Dominic's statement was brief. Today was about truth and protecting users. I hope Ms. Morrison learns that Forbes rankings matter less than human decency. And I hope my daughter remembers that doing the right thing doesn't always feel good. It just feels necessary. The Rolls-Royce pulled away from the courthouse. Scarlett leaned against him, book forgotten. Dad, what happens to Mom Elise now? She faces consequences. Probably loses the company, maybe faces criminal charges. She'll have to rebuild from nothing. Like we pretended to live? Except for her, it won't be pretend. Scarlett was quiet for a long moment. I think you did the right thing, even though it's sad. Dominic pulled her close. That's the thing about integrity, sweetheart. Sometimes it costs everything, and you pay anyway because some debts can only be settled with truth. The car moved through Manhattan, carrying them away from verdict and toward whatever came next. The sun was setting, painting the city in shades that suggested neither triumph nor tragedy, but something more complicated. The messy reality of choices made and consequences faced. Dominic looked at his daughter and understood. This was the real victory, not the judge's ruling or the corrected patent filing, but showing Scarlett that when someone steals from you, you fight back. Not with cruelty, not with revenge, but with truth delivered calmly and without apology. Justice wasn't supposed to feel clean. It felt like survival with casualties on all sides, but it was justice nonetheless, and that would have to be enough.